Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jackie. I'm with Pacific Northwest Publishing. I'm here today with Jessica Sprick for her webinar on strengthening the triangle, Tier 2 and Tier 3 problem-solving processes. She's got a ton of useful information today, so we won't keep you long. But before we let Jess get started, there's a couple quick details to review. If you have questions about the content, you can submit them in the Q&A box on the right side of your screen at any time. We'll review questions at the end with Jessica. Make sure to send them to both the host and the presenter so that I can help track down and make sure we've got all those as the session draws to a close. If you have technical issues, please send me a message in the Q&A box to host, and I will do what I can to assist you. Sometimes you might run into audio troubles if everybody in your computer lab or on-site jumps onto a website or something at a school site. If that's the case, we can get you a call-in phone number so that you can get to the audio via the phone. We do record all of our webinars, and so we'll make this available in just a couple days on our website, along with a copy of the slides at that time. All that said, we can turn things over to Jessica.
Thank you, Jackie. All right. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for those of you who are joining live, and welcome to any of you that are watching this once we archive the webinar. We do have all of our webinars available after the fact, so if you're interested in watching this later, that's also available to you. Just as putting it out there, this is the second part in a two-part webinar series, both which are focused on the notion of how do we ensure that we're creating effective and efficient systems for Tier 2 and Tier 3 behavioral support. So this webinar is focused on problem-solving procedures and the notion of strengthening our triangle by making sure that we're really tightening up all of our systems and structures. The first part of the webinar series was providing an overview of the notion of how to implement a multi-tiered system of support for behavior. It went through differences between interventions at each tier and provided a range of different intervention examples at Tier 2 and Tier 3. If you're interested in viewing that or want to go back and review some of the content, if you go to www.pacificnwpublish.com and then follow the directions to click on webinars and archives and click on Closing the Gaps, November 2017. That is basically the foundational content for what we're going to be talking about today. But even if you did not have access to that webinar previously, if you want to stay on the meeting today and then go back and review it, I basically designed the content to be working in conjunction together, but you're not going to have difficulty understanding the things that I'm talking about, even though this is part 2. So just to kind of ground us on some of those foundational concepts that we discussed in the last webinar, what we're trying to ensure through this content is that we've got multiple tiers of behavioral support. And those of you who are familiar with Randy Sprick and all of his wonderful work, he is my father, for those of you who are wondering the last name and what that relationship is. And one of the things that Randy always says with multi-tiered systems of behavioral support is try the easiest, cheapest thing first and hope you get lucky, which is really just this concept of us trying to be efficient and effective with our resources and ensuring that we're providing the level of intensity of services based on the level of need shown by the student. And so that we're not basically providing, intensive individualized supports to students that don't need it, because really we have to be efficient with our resources given the constraints that we have in schools of limited resources. That last bullet point there is really just the notion that these tiers of behavioral support are basically designed to be a seamless continuum. So even though we have these sort of 3 distinct categories that we talk about, Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3 behavioral support, that really we're looking at this sort of blended continuum where we're trying to ensure that no student is falling through any cracks. And so that's part of what we're really going to be focusing on today, is trying to ensure that there is that seamless support going across all of the tiers and that we don't have any big gaps in services as we're moving from Tier 1 to Tier 2 or Tier 2 to Tier 3 or Tier 1 to Tier 3. So let's continue forward. This webinar is really designed to try and address some of the pitfalls that in our work with safe and civil schools that we've really seen are very common pitfalls that we have when people are implementing this notion of a multi-tiered system. So the first one is the idea that we have too few interventionists in our school systems and too many behavioral referrals for those interventionists to be able to provide effective both problem solving as well as intervention support. And so that's one of the real big gaps that we need to start thinking about how do we address is both how do we expand the range and the number of people who have knowledge of effective behavioral interventions and can provide that support and problem solving, and then also how do we reduce the number of behavioral referrals through effective supports at earlier tiers. So for example, expanding what we're doing at Tier 1 to try and reduce the number of kids that are needing more individualized supports at Tiers 2 and Tier 3. The next thing that we want to think about is how to address that oftentimes there are significant gaps between tiers. And so do we have a backlog of a whole bunch of students who are waiting to be identified for Tier 2 or Tier 3 behavioral support? And is that creating a gap in the level of service that we're providing when students demonstrate a need? We also sometimes see that there's a lack of a systematic process for identifying and implementing interventions. So maybe we have some really great interventions and services available, but we don't have any really clear-cut process and nobody has a great deal of clarity on, you know, if I am a general education teacher and I want to be accessing a certain level of support, who do I go to and how do I ensure that I'm accessing those supports quickly and efficiently? Another possibility that we might have is we have a systematic process, but there isn't a lot of flexibility. And unfortunately, sometimes what we see with these systems where we've got a really clear process, here is who you go to access this level of support, is that sometimes the actions at lower tiers basically become kind of checking off a box. Like, okay, so I'm going to check off that I've done this intervention and I've done it with fidelity, but whether there is actually that real ability to implement it or not. So we also want to be creating, as we're creating these systematic processes, also be creating some flexibility for how do we access those supports, how do we provide supports for both teachers and students. And then another big one is just a lack of follow-through on interventions and thinking through next steps. And the next steps can both be either intensification of supports if we see that interventions at previous tiers have not been successful, but also as a student demonstrates success, hopefully at the lowest tier necessary based on the level of need, that we are thinking and following through on how are we systematically fading these supports. So hopefully the information that I'm providing today is helping you address and think through any of those pitfalls. And you can be thinking right now, you know, which are the ones that I immediately, as soon as Jessica said that, like, oh, that is a gap in our system. Be thinking through what parts of the information that I discussed today are going to help you address those specific issues. So our goals today is really focusing on possible team structures as well as problem-solving processes that you can use to implement this multi-tiered approach. And what that's really focusing on is who. Who are the critical personnel at each tier that we're identifying who are both going to be part of the problem-solving processes that go into identifying interventions and then also following through on making sure that interventions are implemented as we hope they are. And then also the what. So what are the methods that we're using for actually problem solving at different levels? What are the methods that we're using to ensure that each student is receiving the supports that they need and that we're following through on those processes? And then also the bigger picture, are we having methods that ensure we're kind of paying attention to, are our systems functioning effectively? Do we have the interventions available that we need? Do we have the appropriate personnel trained in those interventions? And, you know, do we have like an overflow of students with a particular issue that we need to look at reallocating resources or relooking at how we're addressing that particular behavior or that particular behavioral need at different levels of the system? For those of you who can stay until the end of our 1 hour together, I will have a raffle at the end and we'll kind of randomly select somebody who's been with us for the majority of the webinar. So just to get us started, this diagram is basically something that we've talked about as what we see a lot of times when we go into schools as what they're doing in terms of behavioral support. And so what we have is we've got the general education teacher who's doing everything that they can in their classroom system. And when they're struggling with a particular behavior or they have a concern about a student and they're thinking that they need some intervention support, the main thing that we have in place is some sort of student support team. I've heard of this called a care team. There are lots of other names for it, but basically a set of personnel in the school. It may be an administrator, some interventionists, some teacher leaders, whose job is when a student is referred to that team, we're going to problem solve and think about what needs to happen for intervention. And so this is a very beneficial process in all of our schools. It is something that we recommend, is that most schools have this sort of problem-solving interventionist team. But the problem is that if this is our only layer of support, we end up with a huge backlog oftentimes where the student support team has like 40 to 50 or maybe even more kids that have been referred to the team, and we're trying to be efficient and effective in sort of working through our list of kids, but we end up having to wait for weeks and weeks upon end before intervention kicks in for a lot of kids because we only have this one process. So I'm going to show you a diagram that I'm going to be using throughout the entire rest of the webinar. Don't get overwhelmed at this next view, but this is basically what we're recommending. So I'm going to be describing this in a lot more detail, but what you can see is that rather than that straight across from the general education teacher over to the SS team, which is over in the middle here, we have quite a few different things with lots of those different arrows going to a couple of other groups and problem-solving procedures, as well as the SST team then, if needed, going to a much more intensive level at the multidisciplinary team. So again, this is a fairly complex diagram, but I hope that I'll be able to make it relatively simple throughout the rest of this webinar, basically with the idea that we're trying to create multiple layers of different support and problem-solving processes as well as interventions that are put in place so that we don't have that pitfall of a backlog of students waiting to receive services. So let's go ahead and start with the far left of this where it says Gen Ed teacher early stage interventions, because that's really the earliest stages of what we're trying to do when we identify that a student has an individual need that's not being served. I'm actually going to backtrack even a little bit further. So if I had room on the slide, I would have put this left one that says for school-wide and classroom concerns. And basically when we're thinking about Tier 1, what is the universal problem solving that we're doing, which is basically the base level of service that we're providing for any student. At a school-wide and a classroom level, we can be thinking about any of those school-wide and classroom concerns are being problem solved by a team that's maybe a positive behavioral intervention and support team, that's that PBIS team, MTSSB team, multi-tiered systems of support for behavior team, or response to intervention for behavior, RTI team. And those are basically all terms for similar constructs, which is basically a team of folks at the universal level who are thinking at a systems level about what we're doing for all kids to ensure that things are functioning effectively. And so looking at that green box, what that team is doing is trying to ensure that we've got effective climate and safety efforts as well as classroom level behavior supports for all kids. So that team might be looking at things like, do we want to be thinking about implementing a classroom management approach like CHAMPS? CHAMPS is the version that we use at Safe and Civil Schools at a classroom level because we want to be focusing on Tier 1 problem solving. They could also be looking at things like, do we need to refine our common area policies and procedures because we're seeing some issues in those common areas. So that's our Tier 1, sort of the earliest stage of the problem solving that we're doing. Then, as we have an individual student either in a classroom or the teacher is identifying that this student is having problems in some of those common areas, what we basically have at Tier 1 is the general education teacher doing some problem solving. And here we have what they're doing is early stage interventions. And the early stage interventions are basically interventions that are implemented by the general education classroom teacher as a way to try and provide this earliest stage of problem solving and prevention. Let's see. So what we recommend at Safe and Civil is that at that earliest stage for intervention, that there's a range of basic interventions that all of your teachers are trained to be able to use. And so when we do this support with schools and districts that we work with, we actually train all of the teachers in the school to use the following interventions. The first one is planned discussion. Basically, how do you implement a carefully crafted discussion with a student about a particular behavioral issue where you're setting some goals, you're discussing how this is going to be beneficial for the student, and that discussion is happening at a neutral time. We also could look at academic assessment and assistance and trying to identify if the behavioral issues are related to an academic issue. What do we need to do to adapt and remediate for that academic issue? Then moving down the line into things like systematic goal setting, data collection and debriefing, increasing positive interactions, and STOIC analysis and intervention. STOIC basically being our framework for the main variables that a classroom teacher could manipulate to try and make a difference in changing behavior. And so these basically range from a very, very simple intervention planned discussion to things that are more intensive and take more time and consideration to implement. But we basically, again, recommend that districts have some sort of protocol of a range of interventions that all teachers have been trained to use. In our approach with Safe and Civil, we have these 6, and we're now calling those bridge strategies. So I'm actually going to backtrack for just a second. Notice that in my color coding here, for school-wide and classroom concerns, I've got general climate and safety efforts and classroom behavior support is green. That is the Tier 1 universal level. And then you notice that the early stage interventions off to the right here are still green, but I've made them a little bit more of a yellow shade of green. And that's really trying to get at that notion of these are still a Tier 1 procedure because it's still an individual person who's problem solving and trying to implement these interventions, but we're now starting to move across that Tier 1 to Tier 2, trying to have that bridge so that we don't have that gap in services as we're waiting for Tier 2. All right, so that is basically Tier 1 problem solving and intervention, is it's done by the general education teacher. But what happens when the general education teacher has done everything that they can and now we're starting to struggle, we're continuing to struggle? Where do I as the general education teacher go next? So one of the possibilities is we could go to this notion of teacher-to-teacher problem solving. And so basically what we're starting to do at these Tier 2 levels, notice now we've got the yellow box, is collaborative problem solving. And we're trying to get at that idea of when one person has been struggling and they've exhausted all of their personal resources for knowing how to deal with a specific behavioral issue or a struggle with a student, now we need to get 2 heads are better than 1, right? So if I'm a teacher and I've got a mentor or a peer colleague that I know has a lot of real strong expertise with managing student behavior and supporting student behavior, I could directly go to that other teacher and we could work together to problem solve. It could also be something structured within a school. We have lots of schools that we've seen who create small learning communities, whether that's, at a middle school, if you've got these small learning communities of like a science, math, language arts, and social studies teacher, that team is meeting on a regular basis and problem solving about individual student issues. It could also be a grade level team. So we have all of our 5th grade teachers meet each week, and part of that meeting is problem solving around individual student issues. What we need to have as part of that problem-solving process, though, is something that's relatively concise, that is going to continue keeping the conversation moving forward and really going towards goal-oriented actions. One of the difficulties that we can have when we go to teacher-to-teacher problem-solving methods is that they can either get bogged down in it just turns into a venting session where either one teacher or the whole team is venting about struggles with a student without any real follow-up of brainstorming and then implementation actions of what do we do to actually address those concerns. The other thing that oftentimes happens is that we can get really, really stuck in focusing only on punitive types of consequences and corrective types of consequences. And what we know with positive behavioral support is that we need to be thinking about the structure, we need to be thinking about the ratios of positive interactions, as well as corrective types of consequences and other things that we can do to teach replacement behavior. And so having some sort of concise planning process that allows these teacher-to-teacher conversations to be productive is going to be very beneficial. At Safe and Civil Schools, one of the things that we have developed is this notion of a 25-minute planning process. I'm not sure if you can see that very well, but I've included an example of what we have as this 25-minute planning protocol. I'll talk about where you can find these resources if you're interested in having more thick descriptions of what these are. But what you can see here with this 25-minute planning process is we basically start with a very brief setup from the teacher. So if we've got a group of teachers who are talking together and one teacher has brought this concern forward, we're going to spend 5 minutes talking about things like the student's background, their strengths, and then any of the difficulties that we're seeing in the class. We then move fairly quickly into trying to identify some really specific goals. So if we're going to try and do some intervention, what specific observable goals are we putting in place that are going to be our way of monitoring whether our interventions are working? We then can move into thinking briefly about corrective consequences, but then moving into that more proactive, how are we going to define responsible versus irresponsible behavior? How are we going to teach proactive strategies or reinforce the student positively when it's working? And then you can see there with that final details that we're making sure we've got real clarity on who is doing what and when we're going to be following up. So in 25 minutes, we could have one student and we have a fully crafted intervention plan based on this informal information that we have from the teacher. So that's an example of what we can do with the teacher-to-teacher problem-solving processes. And you can see here that the teacher-to-teacher group is basically brainstorming, are there early-stage interventions that we could help the general education teacher implement? So maybe the teacher has done some things with these early-stage interventions, but we have additional ideas about how that can be done in a very rich and comprehensive way. It might also be moving into more highly structured interventions, and so I'll talk more about what those can be. But basically, if you have teacher leaders on your teams who have been trained in some more intensive interventions, that they could be bringing some ideas to the general education teacher about how to implement those as well. So that's one problem-solving process. Then we also have this notion of an identified interventionist. So if the general education teacher has tried those early-stage interventions, is struggling, they could go directly to any one of a group of identified interventionists that we have on our staff. You also notice that from the teacher-to-teacher, so general education teacher works with their collaborative team of teachers, let's say they're still struggling, then the general education teacher could go to the interventionist if needed. And again, at this level, we're looking at those early stage interventions, possible highly structured interventions, and what I talked about in the last webinar, which were targeted, ready-to-use interventions at Tier 2. So let's dig into that in a little bit more detail. As we're looking at the identified interventionist, again, we're still focusing on collaborative problem solving. We've got the general education teacher and now another interventionist who's helping problem solve. These interventionists are typically, we've got our counselors, our school psychs, if we have social workers, if there's instructional or behavioral coaches, teacher leaders who have been trained in behavioral intervention, administrator, dean of students. And so what we may want to develop is at this interventionist level, we have a list of, if you as a general education teacher are struggling, you could go to any one of these individuals on our school team or even a district team if you wanted to be thinking about additional supports at the district level to say, I need some help and support in problem solving. How do I support this student in my classroom? So you can see here, now we're greatly expanding beyond just one team that meets like once a week to now we have a couple of different ways that the general education teacher can access support prior to needing to go to that level. What we have for each of these folks is that they're trained in basic behavioral consultation using protocols of behavioral intervention. And here now we're getting into more depth beyond the early stage interventions and going more into those highly structured interventions. So I'll talk you through some examples of what that might look like in a moment. And also that each of these personnel who's an individual interventionist is aware of whatever ready-to-use interventions that we have at Tier 2. So some examples of that is like a connections or a check-in, check-out type of intervention that any one of these interventionists could say, I think in talking with you that this student would benefit from being a part of this intervention, so I'm going to help you access that support for that student. So as we think about those highly structured interventions, from the interventions book that we have available, we have the early stage interventions that I listed before, planned discussion, academic assistance, and so on. But we also move into what we term highly structured interventions. So managing physically dangerous behavior, severely disruptive behavior, managing the cycle of emotional escalation into things like cueing and pre-correcting. So what we typically recommend as we train interventionists on this is that everybody who's an interventionist gets sort of a broad overview and a broad understanding of what these interventions are when they're appropriate. And then what you could do is you could take your list of interventionists, again, your counselor, social worker, school psych, et cetera, and basically have one or two personnel who are experts in a particular intervention. So where these interventionists are going to be aware of the broad range of interventions that we have available, we have specific folks who have more knowledge and more training in specific types of interventions. So we might have the counselor and the social worker be the experts in if a student has physically dangerous or severely disruptive behavior or emotional escalation. Those two individuals are point people where when we identify that that's the intervention that needs to be put in place, that's going to be the interventionist that we're going to link up with that teacher. Whereas we have another person whose expertise is cueing and pre-correcting, self-monitoring, and self-evaluation. So if we identify that that's what the student needs, we can link that teacher with that particular interventionist. So that's another way to ensure that we've got multiple people on our staff who have this knowledge of where we might go and can help link to the resources and supports of individual interventionists who have a higher level of expertise with a particular intervention. We also want to make sure that anyone who is at that interventionist level knows about and is ready to plug students into or help the teacher access any of our ready-to-use interventions. So those of you who attended the last webinar might remember that what I talked about at Tier 2 is we want to ensure that we've got a range of different interventions that we can basically plug students into within about 3 to 5 days. So once we identify that the student has a need and we can identify sort of a basic function of what the student might be doing through that behavior, we could try and link them with one of these Tier 2 types of supports. So special attention for targeted students, connections, which is like check-in, check-out, or if I have a student who needs a meaningful job or a meaningful role to create engagement in the school and positive interactions with staff members, assigning them to a meaningful work intervention. The problem-solving process that we recommend at this level, so remember at the teacher-to-teacher level, I talked about that 25-minute planning process. What Safe and Civil has at the intervention level is when we have an interventionist who's working with an individual teacher, we have this teacher interview, which is basically a very informal, formal, functional behavioral assessment process. So it's sort of the very early stage of trying to identify function just through this interview that I would have with a teacher. And again, trying to make it a relatively succinct process that we're able to do the interview and kick in some interventions fairly quickly so that hopefully we can get some interventions in place. And then if this doesn't work, we can go into more systematic data collection. So notice, I'm not completely sure whether or not this is coming through clearly for you, but we have stage 1 as the background, and we're asking some questions: when and where do the problems problems occur, starting to think about what might the student be trying to get served through this. Is it power and control? Is it attention? Is it escape from a particular activity or people that they're around? And then we move into this problem solving of what different interventions can we pull in to try and make a difference with that. As we're thinking about that, so if you're using the interventions process, what we have at this first one where it says stage 2 preparation is we have the whole list of all of the interventions that, again, we would hope all teachers are trained in those early stage interventions, and then as it goes into tier 2, that all of our interventionists are aware of these different interventions that are available. And so what we can do is we can start looking at this list and thinking about what might be appropriate in building a plan for this student. If you don't use interventions, or if you use it and you also have other interventions that you've pulled in, so things like First Step Next or an on-task type of intervention, you can be adding to this so that basically you have a menu that as we're problem solving with a teacher, the interventionist and the teacher, we can start to make logical links from here's our whole range of different things that we can do, what are we going to pull in to create a reasonable and a logical plan? So that's a sample of the teacher interview that we're doing at this, usually at a tier 2 level. So again, back to our picture here. We've had the general education teacher has tried some things. They've gone either to teacher problem solving or directly to an interventionist. And then another possibility that we have is that the general education teacher could go straight to the student support team. So if you look at that long arrow down at the bottom, this is not to say that this is like the teacher has to follow step 1, step 2, step 3. If the general education teacher is really seriously concerned and wants to get some group collaborative problem solving going, they could go directly to the student support team. But what we want to ensure is that we do have that interventionist level as well as teacher-to-teacher level at the earlier stages so that if there is that backlog, the teacher isn't waiting to get support. So again, we're trying to increase the efficiency of our systems. Now, notice also that I have arrows going from teacher-to-teacher to SST team. And I also have an arrow going from interventionist to SST team. So if we've tried some things at those teacher-to-teacher levels or the interventionist level, it's still not working, then we refer it to an SST team, and now we're starting to get even more collaborative, even more heads and expertise together trying to think about how do we craft a plan that's going to be effective for this student and this teacher. So let's take a look more specifically at what that SST team is and does. And so basically this is an intervention planning team. Again, some schools and districts call this student support team, some call it a care team. There's lots of different names for this, but it's basically a group of people that have some behavioral expertise that meet regularly, usually once a week, to problem solve about individual student issues. What they're doing is trying to ensure that each student has a plan for moving forward with intervention. And so I'm going to talk in a moment about the idea of either going to an advocate or to a more intensive multidisciplinary team. If the SST team is thinking, you know, this is a problem that we think we can craft a plan together to think about, and it's not going to need to go to that more intensive tier 3 level yet, then we recommend, again, going back to that 25-minute planning process that I previewed earlier in the session. So basically what we're doing is we're having possibly the interventionist and the teacher come into the meeting, provide some background. Sometimes what we actually have is we have a blend where the interventionist and the teacher have worked together on that teacher interview that I just spoke about, and then they're coming into the student support team meeting and working through the 25-minute planning process where they're basically providing an overview from that interview of here's what we discussed, here's what's been tried, and then we're going through that fairly succinct process for thinking about what are additional interventions that we can start to pull into place. Another thing that the SST team should be doing is trying to have a fairly succinct process for also ensuring that we're not overwhelming any individual interventionist or specific interventions. So part of that process is also going to be just a quick review. We might have each person on the team go around and say, all right, I had these teachers brought these students to my attention. I'm now working with them on trying to come up with intervention plans. I'm also serving as an advocate for these particular students, and if any individual is starting to say, I'm getting very overwhelmed and I'm not able to efficiently be working with these teachers because I have too many students that I'm working with, that we could sort of reallocate resources for support and reassign an individual interventionist to work with a teacher. Also thinking about, let's say we had a check-in, check-out or connections type of intervention where we could also be looking at, we have 40 students who are in this intervention and we've got 5 more that just cropped up as maybe needing support. Do we need to add another interventionist to be supporting that particular intervention, or do we need to be thinking about shuffling some of the students into other available supports that we have? So that's discussion about the SST team. Now, notice as I fly in this next part, so we have the arrow going from interventionist advocate right at the middle there, going over to SST team, but we can also have the arrow going back. So if the SST team gets information about a student, we problem solve, then we can also move it back to the interventionist advocate level where that individual person is overseeing the interventions that we put in place. So the notion of an advocate is basically saying that any student that's identified for Tier 2 problem-solving types of interventions, we need to ensure that there's one interventionist who is basically case managing that student and ensuring that we're investigating the problem appropriately, that we've linked them to supports and resources, possibly our targeted interventions, possibly working with the teacher to try and identify what interventions are needed, and that our possible advocates are all of the same people that I mentioned before, administrator, dean, social worker, et cetera. But notice that we also have a couple of other personnel, nurse, resource officer, parent liaison. So for example, if we have a student where we notice that behavioral issues are related to some sort of medical problem, it might be logical to assign the nurse as the advocate who's going to be overseeing whatever interventions are put in place for that student. All right, so now we've talked about sort of these early stages, Tier 1, Tier 2 types of interventions, and what happens if we're now at the point where the SST team is saying, we've tried everything that we can and it's still not working, or if we have a situation where it really is a highly physically dangerous behavior or something that's so severely disruptive that we think we need to go to more intensive supports right away. Now we can move from the SST team to a more intensive multidisciplinary team. And many of the players that you have on your multidisciplinary team will overlap with people that are on the SST team. So your counselors, your social workers, school psychologists, and so on. But what we like to think of with a multidisciplinary team is that this is a somewhat more ad hoc team that is basically meeting whenever needed to problem solve for an individual student. So the SST team, in contrast, is meeting regularly. They're a group of regular players that meets together, and anytime a student is referred to that team, they're problem solving briefly around what to do for that student. Then if that's not effective, then we can bump it to this more intensive multidisciplinary team where now we're starting to look at full-blown functional behavior assessment, a case manager who's following all aspects of the interventions that are put together, and moving into much more intensive types of resources that go into intervention. Part of what also distinguishes the problem solving that's done by the multidisciplinary team as compared to a student support team is that there really isn't a time limit placed on how much time we're going to spend problem solving for this kid. So an SST team meeting might spend 25 minutes or 30 or 40 minutes problem solving for an individual student, whereas the multidisciplinary team might be an initial 2-hour meeting. It could move into more intensive problem solving and additional meetings that then are pulling in family members and other personnel and supports as needed. So looking at what the multidisciplinary team is doing, we're now at this stage going into functional behavioral assessment, which for those of you who are not familiar with that term, that's basically what has come as the recommendation as an evidence-based support for students that have very, very intensive behavioral needs. It's a process that we go through of trying to gather data to understand what is the cause of the student's behavior or the multiple causes of the student's behavior, and putting an intervention plan in place that's trying to support whatever functions we identify. With multidisciplinary team planning, Safe and Civil Schools also has an additional intervention decision guide, which we call the MDT, Multidisciplinary Team Form, and it's basically a much more in-depth version of what you would be doing to problem solve and select interventions. We also want to ensure that we're assigning a case manager. The case manager is parallel to the idea of an advocate at Tier 2, but basically a case manager being somebody who's just watching much more carefully and closely and kind of keeping a pulse on what's going on with the interventions and trying to ensure that we've got coordination between different services that are going on for this student, and that we can get increasingly intensive and complex with the interventions that we're putting in place as demonstrated by the need of the student. So if you look over here, you can see we've got everything from the early stage and highly structured interventions that could be put in place. We could be continuing to use or putting in place more of those ready-to-use interventions, and then also looking into things like wraparound services within the school, community-based mental health or physical health services or other types of supports, as well as special education referral. So as we start to get into this multidisciplinary team approach, we recognize that we may need to be thinking about outside collaboration. We're also thinking about coordinating lots of different players to design more intensive interventions. So that's part of why we want to be preserving our resources at earlier stages, and hopefully any students that have a less intensive need, that we've gone through some systematic supports at earlier stages that allow them to get the supports that they need, so that it's only the students who truly have a very multifaceted, very complex behavioral issue who are getting to this multidisciplinary team level. Here is a sample of the MDT, that multidisciplinary team problem-solving process. So these first 3 pages are basically data collection. It talks about records reviews, it talks about direct observations, interviews with staff, student, parent, or guardian, and so really that the onus of this work is now going into data collection, and that when we meet as a multidisciplinary team, we've got as much information as we can possibly have about what the student needs in order to move forward with designing an intervention. Then as we go into intervention design, you can see here we're looking at the hypothesis based on the data that we have. What is the function of the behavior? We're again brainstorming possible interventions and then really trying to come up with a clear plan. Who is doing what? When are we going to follow up? What data will we be collecting to identify whether things are working? And then those specific team actions that every person is going to take. Notice on this form that unlike the other forms that I've shown you, there aren't any times associated with each step of this. So with the 25-minute planning process, we're trying to make sure that we stick to specific times for brainstorming, for discussing the problem, for goal setting, whereas once we get to this multidisciplinary team, it's much less time-driven and much more of a recognition that this student has some really intensive needs, and so problem solving is going to take some time. All right, so just thinking that was a lot of information thrown at you, and hopefully in conjunction with the previous webinar, that gives you some conceptual understanding as well as some concrete thinking about what you might be able to do. Looking at this first figure, which says components of BRTI, that's basically behavioral response to intervention. Same notion as MTSS-B or PBIS, is that we're basically trying to think about developing this continuum of problem-solving processes as well as interventions that go from low cost and time efficient for kids that have some level of need of support, but maybe they're still in the green zone or moving briefly into the yellow, moving up to high cost and time-consuming processes. And so as we develop this range of problem-solving processes, processes. You see down here, planning by general education teacher up to complete FBA given by a certified behavior analyst. We're basically trying to fill in between, that we have that range of problem-solving processes and ways that a teacher can access support, or even a parent if they notice that there's an issue and their student needs support, that we have a range of different structures and procedures in place that allow us to try and get support at earlier stages before we have to get to that high cost and very time-consuming procedure of complete FBAs and multifaceted intervention plans. So looking at figure 3.2, you can see that I kind of overviewed what this might look like in action if you're using Safe and Civil's model, that we start with that planning by a general education teacher at Tier 1. We move into the teacher-to-teacher problem-solving intervention planning team, or an identified interventionist who's working directly with that teacher. If those then are not working, we can move into that multidisciplinary team or a crisis or threat assessment team if it's something that's severely physically dangerous. And then at Tier 3, that idea of a complete FBA. So that's the continuum that we recommend, and if we work with districts and schools, that we train people on these protocols. So those are your problem-solving processes. Now moving back over to figure 3.1, notice next to develop a variety of problem-solving processes, we have identify a protocol of evidence-based interventions. So concurrently with those problem-solving processes, which are basically the who is doing the problem-solving, we're also thinking about what are the interventions that we could put in place across that continuum of behavior. So from planned discussion, which is sort of one of the easiest, simplest individual interventions, to something like an intervention for depression or anxiety that's guided by a school psychologist, or in conjunction with mental health services outside of the school. So thinking about that continuum across the range of behaviors that we see, from things that are very easy and simple to intervene with to things that are much more complex and time and resource intensive. All right, so just kind of getting us to a close, and then I'll go ahead and take questions. If you're interested in looking at the Safe and Civil Schools resources that we have that go into much more detail than what I just overviewed very briefly, if you're looking for that sort of process orientation or the big picture thinking about how do we implement a multi-tiered system of support, we have Foundations Module F. Foundations is Safe and Civil Schools Tier 1 Universal Positive Behavioral Interventions and Supports model, and it's multiple different modules, and the last one, Module F, is focusing on this continuum of Tier 2 and Tier 3. So how do we move across those tiers of behavior support? We also have this resource, Behavioral Response to Intervention, which does have the samples of the 25-minute planning process, the teacher interview, and so on, and provides lots of information about how to create this continuum of behavior support. So basically, the information that I overviewed today is going to be in both of those resources in different levels of depth. If you're looking for Tier 1 types of resources, we have CHAMPS and Discipline in the Secondary Classroom, which are more of that universal classroom level of support. What are you doing to support all students and try and create effective procedures that allow students to learn? But CHAMPS and Discipline in the Secondary Classroom do also have one fairly in-depth chapter about how to intervene with individual students at a classroom level. We also have Teacher's Encyclopedia, which is 500 behavior management plans for 100 different behavior problems. So that's another teacher level of problem solving, where if the teacher says, I have this specific issue, I can go to this resource and try and see which behavior plans may be most manageable and effective in this particular situation. And as I said before, the interventions book, which has the early stage interventions, which we would hope that all general education teachers have an awareness about how to implement those. Moving over to the right side of the screen, we also have a range of lots of different evidence-based and research-based resources for managing behavior with small groups, as well as individual students at a Tier 2 level. And then at Tier 3, a couple of recommendations. Again, the interventions book looking at those highly structured interventions. We also have a comprehensive bullying solutions assessment system that's functional behavior assessment of bullying, as well as interventions to deal with those issues, and a corresponding similar resource but focused on how to address absenteeism and truancy issues. If you're also interested in looking at more just general functional behavior assessment training, we recommend Chris Borgmeier, B-O-R-G-M-E-I-E-R, I believe, and Sheldon Lohman have some great resources related to functional behavior assessment. There's also PBIS Technical Assistance Centers have some great resources, and RTI Action Network. So those are some great places to go if you're looking for more resources for Tier 3. Last little bit that I want to let you guys know about is if this information seems like something that would be useful in your district and you're looking for a very comprehensive way to try and ensure that you've got personnel who are trained to do these different interventions and also be looking at setting up effective problem-solving procedures and processes for Tier 2 and Tier 3 support, Safe and Civil Schools is now rolling out a cohort training model where we can work with a district and pull student support teams from each of the different schools. We could also work with educational service districts where any school in the educational service district could send a team of folks, and basically trying to provide 3 to 7 days of training across 2 to 3 years, so 3 to 7 days per year across 2 to 3 years, and going into real depth on data collection, analysis, and decision-making procedures, training in specific interventions at Tier 2 and Tier 3, like connections and meaningful work, some of the Tough Kid materials and social skills curricula, training in all of the interventions in the interventions book, and also specific training in those Tier 3 functional behavior assessment procedures. So if that's something that you're interested in, feel free to contact us. I'll throw up some contact information in a moment. So I think, Jackie, we can go ahead and open it up for questions, and notice that we'll be doing the raffle in a moment. If you've got additional questions about resources, you can look at our website, www.pacificnorthwestpublish.com. If you're also interested in learning more about that cohort model or specific trainings for any of the things that I discussed, contact Safe and Civil Schools. And let's go ahead and open it up for questions.
Okay, Jess, I have a question from early in the webinar, which was, do you ever involve parents in the problem-solving process? If so, at what stage?
Absolutely. That's really you know, up to you as a team about when it's going to be effective to involve the parent. We always recommend erring on the side of more parent involvement rather than less, because we know the importance of having that collaboration between home and school, and that it can really be strengthened when we have those supports in place. We do recommend always getting permission from parents for different aspects of the interventions that we're planning to put in place, and definitely at the point that you're moving into that multidisciplinary team, we would highly, highly recommend that it becomes a integrated with parents type of model of intervention.
Terrific. We have a few folks who've asked about the slides. Just a quick FYI that we will upload those slides along with the recorded webinar in a day or two's time. Another question just indicated, I went to a training recently in which the speaker encouraged interventionists to begin meetings by looking at the behavioral skill each particular student is lacking. What are your thoughts?
So I have a slightly different opinion on that, just in the sense that I prefer to start with student strengths, just so that, you know, it's very, very easy for people to hyper-focus on all of the negative things about a student. And so if we launch right in with starting to talk about what are the issues, we can very quickly get into some of that less productive venting rather than problem solving. I do think if you're using a specific protocol where you've got identified agenda items. And so if we want to start by saying, you know, why was this student referred, or what brought this student as a concern and made you want to come to this meeting or made you want to meet with me, that would be an okay starting place, but that it's very quickly followed up with identifying what are some strengths that the student brings to the table and what are some things that we might think about being able to use as sort of launching boards because there's already something positive going on.
Terrific. Another question, any advice for districts that have a policy of providing SBAs only for students with IEPs or being evaluated for IEPs?
Interesting. Well, I'm very much a proponent of starting function-based thinking at the earliest stages possible. And so a possible way to address that would be in thinking about who are the players in your school that maybe are not, you know, certified behavior analysts, that that person's time is being preserved for functional behavior assessment for the kids who are on IEPs, for the kids that have that intensive level of identification. But thinking about how could we get a range of other interventionists who have behavioral knowledge and expertise and that really good understanding of how to work with behavior supports to support a student, and getting them trained in basic functional behavior assessment procedures. So maybe they don't go the full level of a certified behavior analyst, but that we're getting them some of that skills and knowledge and training in how to think about function and what are the common functions that we're looking for, how do we look at data to identify those, and then how do we make those logical links between the data and the intervention. So I actually am a fan of even thinking about starting that with all of our teachers, that we're getting them very, very basic rudimentary understanding of function, and that we intensify it with the other supports that we have in our school system so that, again, it creates that sort of seamless continuum, even if we are preserving some of the people with the most expertise for the ones that are identified with special ed.
The next question, are special educators usually part of the multidisciplinary team in your experience?
I think it varies by school and by district. You know, much of that is going to be determined just based off of people's schedules as well as, you know, the different levels of knowledge and expertise. I do think it's beneficial when you can have one or more special educators on there because they often do have more specific training in like discrete skill training and some of the things that are going to be beneficial. But if you don't have them, you know, those are also people that could be pulled in when we move into that multidisciplinary level team, if we have a student who has specific needs, that special educator has some expertise in how to address that.
Perfect. What is your recommendation for addressing teachers who want to jump to Tier 3 because they've done much in their classrooms but have not documented or passed on information to the high school counselor?
Absolutely. That's a very common problem and question, and there's kind of I think two things going on in that question. One is the teacher who sort of says they've checked all of the boxes, but there's a concern that they haven't actually implemented well or with fidelity. And then there's also the concern of we just don't have any data to document that. I think one thing to consider is that a teacher who is moving to asking for that level of support is demonstrating that there's a real level of crisis or need for that particular teacher. And so part of what we can be thinking about is you know, what might we be able to put in place to do a little bit of almost pain management in the interim while we're then working on trying to go back, and the identified interventionist is working with the teacher to try some different things within the classroom setting or to get that documentation that might be needed to demonstrate, oh, these things haven't worked. So maybe that is pulling in for a short period of time, we're going to put in a Tier 2 intervention or something else in place that's outside of the classroom to try and create sort of a base of support for that student while we're also working with building the level of skill for the teacher.
Terrific. We've got several more questions. We know some people will have to fade away as the hour draws to a close, but we'll just keep going through these questions. You'll be able to see them in the recorded webinar later if you do have to leave us. The next
Jackie,
one,
should we go ahead and do, Jackie, since we're coming close to the end of our time, should we go ahead and do the raffle and then we can finish up the questions?
Sure. So we drew names
Great.
just a couple minutes ago. And
who's our behavioral response to intervention winner? Bill Cassidy, great.
We've got Bill Cassidy and Tracy Hurlitz. I probably butchered that name.
So, Jackie, how do you want people to, do you have their contact information, or do you want them to get in touch with you?
I actually have their contact information from when they signed up.
Lovely. All right, so we'll be following up with our 2 raffle winners, and let's go ahead and continue on with questions.
Terrific. Let's see, let me find where I left off. Who is responsible for implementing the ready-to-use interventions, such as meaningful work, leadership class, structured recess, etc.? And then how do you get team members on board to be case managers? It seems like much of this will end up in the school counselor's lap.
Great question. So you are correct that the identified interventionists on the staff may take a good portion of the load of running lots of these interventions. So just for example, connections, which again is our version of a check-in, check-out type of system, oftentimes might be a counselor who has 10 kids that they're meeting with on a regular basis and providing that morning and possibly afternoon check-in and check-out. But what we have seen is that ways that schools have been able to expand the use of these different types of interventions is like for a connections, you could have a couple of people who are providing oversight of that intervention. So that might be the counselor, or it might be a dean of students, or somebody who's at that sort of broader level. But then you could open it up to say, are there any teachers? Are there any classified staff? Do we have a janitor who builds great relationships with kids, who could serve in that direct mentorship role and be collecting the data sheets each day and then providing them to the interventionist that's providing oversight and more of the, let's analyze some of the data trends because that person has more of that behavioral knowledge and expertise, and then is working with those individual teachers or classified staff members who are also supporting kids. We also see that with meaningful work. So meaningful work being a meaningful jobs intervention where we could create lots of different jobs throughout our campus. We could open it up to any teacher who wants to be a job supervisor for a particular kid, any of our classified staff members. We could create lots of different opportunities that each have like one staff member who's working directly with the child and taking the data, but then that's all going back to the identified interventionist who's overseeing that. So that's definitely a way that we've seen schools expand the number of students that they can support, and also getting lots of other adults involved in that intervention process, which can be very meaningful for lots of folks in the school.
Terrific. It's me just a moment. There's some sirens going by. Our district is big on timelines. Can you explain how long teachers should try ideas they've established themselves before moving to a team or teacher-to-teacher help?
That's a great question. We typically recommend with whatever behavior intervention is being tried, whether it's at the general education teacher level, they're just doing it on their own, they've problem solved, they're implementing, or if it's something at Tier 2 or Tier 3 type of intervention level, that you're trying something and really trying it with your best intentions, your best efforts with fidelity for about 2 weeks while you're taking data, and then making decisions about, is it flatlined and I'm not seeing any progress, so it's not harming anything, but it's not really doing any good. Did the behavior get worse, in which case I know that was not the right intervention to put in place, or am I starting to see some progress and I want to stay on this track and either just keep going the way that I'm going or keep trying it and layer in something additional. So typically that notion of giving yourself 2 weeks for each thing, and when we think about the early stage interventions, what we typically recommend is that teachers are kind of moving progressively through that protocol of we've got these 6 or however many interventions, and we want you to move somewhat systematically through them because planned discussion is the easiest one to implement, and that's going to give you some information right away about some of the behaviors that you're dealing with if that doesn't work. kind of moving progressively through those, but also that if any teacher is feeling an excessive level of sort of, you know, this is not working and it's blowing apart my classroom, that they could bypass and go to any of those later problem-solving structures as needed. And so that's part of the reason to try and create both knowledge that all general education teachers have, so that it allows them to have a bit more power and control of trying to do some things in their own classroom and feeling like they can get a handle on some of these earlier issues, but also making sure that any teacher that really doesn't feel, you know, maybe I haven't even tried that intervention, but this is so out of control in my classroom, I need to get somebody else who's giving me some support and some feedback. That's part of the reason that we want to ensure that it's not just the general education teacher direct to the SST, because they might have to wait 4 weeks to be able to get that service. So having them have multiple different avenues that they could reach out to who can give problem solving and suggestions about what they could then implement in their class.
Terrific. You've probably kind of spoke to this already, but I'm going to run the question through, which says,
okay.
How do you get staff buy-in when they already feel overwhelmed with daily responsibilities, academically focused expectations, Tier 1 and Tier 2 level staff resistance?
That's a good question. It's pretty big. You know, I think if you're in a situation where people are really struggling with that, as they naturally are. There are so many responsibilities, so many things for them to be doing. You know, one possibility is just to be providing very concrete, small steps at a time. So, you know, we're going to provide you this one example of an intervention. We're going to try and train you in it fairly quickly during this staff meeting. We'd like to ask that next time that we meet together, have tried this on a student and bring some data to talk about, did it work, did it not? And so we're really trying to create sort of succinct things that allow teachers to get a fairly quick win on some of these things, and that maybe we even go to that teacher-to-teacher problem solving within that same meeting. So if you bring your planned discussion student, and hopefully some people are able to report out, oh, this worked beautifully. We have had so many examples where people who thought that it was a really intensive level of need that the student had, they have a planned discussion and all of a sudden the problem goes away. So hopefully you've got some of those successes that allow people to see some of these problems will be addressed by these fairly simple solutions, but then we can also start moving into a little bit more of group think about some of the problems that were not as easy to resolve.
Perfect. There's another question. Do you have a TOT, train the trainer, for this 3-year program you mentioned at the end of the presentation?
The cohort training model? If that's what you're referring to, which I'm guessing it is, we don't at this time, because we basically, what we've had is we've had all of these different components. So we've had interventions training, we've had meaningful work, we've had tough kid training. We've had all of these different components available, and we're just now starting to really try and create this systematic package for folks. So we are at the early stages of implementing this. We've had a large district that has now gone through training for all of their schools. That's going very, very well. We've gotten great positive feedback as well as data from that. But we don't have a TOT at this time. If that's something that you're interested in sort of conceptualizing with us and seeing what might be possible, I would encourage you to get in touch with our Director of Professional Development, and that's with that number that I have on the screen. Her name is Elizabeth Winford, and she would be more than happy to get me on the phone, get Randy on the phone, and be problem solving and thinking through what might we put together to create a package that meets the needs that you're hoping to get.
Yeah. And I imagine creating a TOT model for that may take a couple of years, but we could certainly look at training options for pieces and parts to bring that online.
Yes, definitely.
That is most of the big, wider type questions. There was a question about are some of the worksheets shared available online or just in the books? Several of them, most of them are part of the particular titles. We'll certainly put our heads together here and see if there are any that are shareable outside of having the materials. Sometimes, you know, just the form doesn't make sense without some of the supporting information, and we don't want to send people down a rabbit hole without the right pieces.
Absolutely. I would say if there's a specific form that you're interested in seeing if we could provide a copy to you, if you want to email me directly, my email is Jessica, Jessica, at Pacific NW Publish, so like Pacific Northwest Publish, PacificNWPublish.com. And please just send me an email, say, is it possible for me to get a copy of the IDG teacher interview or whichever form it is that you're interested in, and I'd be happy to see what we need to do to get permissions to send that to you.
No problem. A couple people inquired early on about some of the forms. The 25-minute planning process for meetings is part of behavioral response to intervention, correct, Jess?
Correct, yes.
Yeah, just so that people are pointed to that.
Yeah,
that is all the questions we have, and so that should wrap that up. If people have additional questions that come up, you can always send them to either Jessica at the jessica@pacificnwpublish.com address, or you can send them to us at info@pacificnwpublish.com, and we can route them to Jess if you can't find that address.
Great. Thank you, everybody, so much for attending, and Jackie, thank you for facilitating.
No problem. We appreciate all of you that have hung in there with us. We know it's a big chunk of your day. We will send out the link in the next day or two to the recording and the slides and all of that additional information for you.